Hi, everyone. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. I would like to welcome you to our event in celebration of the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, the new book by Daniel Yergin. Thank you all for supporting a local independent bookstore. University Bookstore is the oldest independent bookstore in the region. In fact, we're celebrating our 120th anniversary this year. We're always grateful for your patronage, and especially now in this pandemic year where the fate of bookstores and all small businesses is uncertain. We're currently open to the public 12 to 4 Monday through Sunday and also offer curbside pickup. Please check our website, ubookstore.com, for the latest information about our hours. For more than a century, energy, its availability, access, and flows has been intertwined with security and geopolitics, and more than ever before, this nexus will shape the future. Here to tell us more about that is Pulitzer Prize-winning author Daniel Yergin, a highly respected authority on energy, international politics, and economics. He's also the best-selling author of The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, The Quest, Energy, Security, and the Remaking of the Modern World, and Shattered Peace, The Origins of the Cold War, and co-author of Commanding Heights, The Battle for the World Economy. Daniel is vice chairman of IHS Markit, one of the leading information and research firms in the world, a member of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior trustee of the Brookings Institution, and has served on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board under the last 4 presidential administrations. Today's discussion will be moderated by Ross Reynolds, KUOW's executive producer of community engagement. His projects include the person-to-person conversation event, Ask A, and That's Debatable, Amazon is Good for Seattle. Ross came to KUOW in 1987 as a news director and holds a master's degree in digital media from the School of Communication at the University of Washington. Just a few more things before we get started. We'll post the link to the new map through the chat periodically. This event is being recorded and will be on University Bookstore's YouTube channel in about 2 to 3 days. If you have any questions for Daniel, please put them in the chat field and Ross will moderate. And now I'll turn it over to Ross and Daniel.
Yes, I'll just add that it's also apt to be on Speakers Forum on KUOW. So if you like what you hear and you'd like to refer it to someone, have them check that out. Along with the other credits, which were already mentioned, Daniel's a terrific writer. The new map is a sweeping, gripping history of how the world has been changed by its energy sources and how the transition from fossil fuels to renewable resources is affecting us now and will affect us in the near future. Now, you're right, Daniel, that although some won't want to hear it, oil will remain the primary fuel that makes the world go round. Why do you say that?
Well, let me first say I'm very pleased to be here with you, Ross, and to be in this discussion with you. And also very impressed to congratulate University Bookstore on 120 years. That's an incredible achievement and a great sign of its significance for its community. So to speak under your joint auspices is a much valued opportunity. Well, I don't say it's going to remain the dominant fuel. I really say that it's going to be a mixed system as we go ahead towards that year 2050, that the scale of where we are today, 84% of world energy comes from fossil fuels. There's no question a transition is happening. There's no question the direction. It's just how fast can it go? And I think also people overlook, they think oil is just about transportation. And if we just go to that debate that some may remember a few weeks ago between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they got in an argument about restaurants and people going into restaurants. And Joe Biden said, well, we'll have plexiglass in restaurants. Of course, plexiglass is a petroleum product. So hospital operating room is dominated by plastics. So there's other uses of oil other than combustion in an automobile engine.
It wasn't that many years ago that the great debate, the great discussion was over peak oil, the idea that at what point will the world just run out of oil? Now that concern seems to have evaporated. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, it's a complete flip around. If you're quite right, Ross. If you go back a dozen years, the world was going to run out of oil. And then this thing happened in the United States called the Shale Revolution and changed the entire balance of oil. And the US went from importing 60% of its oil and was seen to go to 70 to 80%. with a lot of costs, both political and economic, to a position today where the United States is essentially energy independent. And by the way, is also the world's largest oil producer. And it's happened in 10 years.
And how has that influenced America's place in the world to go from all these concerns about another oil shortage crisis to a place that exports oil, that has a surplus?
It gives the U.S. well, it gives the U.S. a new stature in the world, and it gives flexibility in the world that it didn't have before when we were dependent upon imported oil. And you can really see it in a country that I know well, that I'm involved with, is India. And now the U.S. exports energy, oil and gas to India. And the Prime Minister Modi has said that that's now one of the cornerstones of a growing relationship between the United States.
You're right. Unlike the discussion about peak oil, the discussion now is not when the oil will be gone, but when the demand for it will hit its high point and begin to decline. When do you see that happening? What's your
Ross,
timeline?
let me just back up to just something else, another really good example. Whether you liked Obama's approach to Iran, Trump's approach to Iran, or what will be Joe Biden's approach to Iran, we wouldn't be able to do any of that were it not for the changed position in oil, because the Iranians, they scoffed when Obama was pursuing a nuclear deal because they thought the world needed their oil, and it turned out the world didn't need their oil. And, you know, the world's working fine without their oil, insofar as it's working right now. Your question about peak demand.
Yes.
Yes. That is, you know, that's one of the, so as you said, it was peak oil, which meant running out of supply. And now it's peak oil, sort of running out of demand. Well, we're going to see more electric cars in the fleet. But I think that still, you know, when we come out of COVID on a global basis, and if world economy starts growing again, and you see rising incomes in countries like China and India, you'll see increased consumption. So I think peak oil probably demand, at this point, it looks like it's around 2030 or the early 2030s, which used to sound far away, but isn't anymore.
Well, 10 years. But does that give us enough time to avoid the climate catastrophe that some predict if we don't reach that peak of demand for another 10 years?
Yes, because, you know, there's no way that you're going to turn it off in 10 years. So mitigation is an important part. Carbon capture is an important part of it. Renewables will grow a lot, but renewables don't power cars. The average car in the United States stays on the road 12 to 15 years. So those cars just aren't going to disappear overnight. So I think, I think you'd have to look different. There are different, I forgot how many scenarios there are in the UN's climate thing, but there are a lot of different scenarios. But I mean, the reality is we will move towards increased renewables. We'll move towards a lower carbon future. I think US CO2 emissions now, I think, are back to the 1983 level, although our economy has more than doubled since then. Ironically, that's because natural gas, mainly because natural gas has replaced coal in generating electricity.
You know, many businesses are now talking about how they're going to be working on reducing their use of oil, how they're going to get to net zero. Even the big oil companies are touting the fact that they're being part of this transition. Do you think that beyond what they're saying, that businesses that are consuming and driving the demand for oil really are converting to a different view of the future, or is this just for show? What do you think?
No, I think it's, you know, you can take some of the, tech companies in Seattle. They're, increasingly focused on renewable generation or offsetting it. So I think there's a huge effort that's going into it. And I think you see, some of the oil companies now say, well, we're energy companies and setting targets of net zero carbon by 2050. That seems to become the benchmark. In the new map, I say the world, when it comes to energy, the world divides in two. There's the pre-Paris era and the after-Paris era. We're in the after-Paris era. Paris is a climate conference of 2015, and it's taken we're 5 years away from it now, almost exactly 5 years away from it. And those goals are increasingly embedded in the policies of countries, in the attitudes of investors, and in company strategies. How you get there is a challenge, we did a study with Ernie Moniz, the former energy secretary, for the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, about the technologies we don't have yet. So you need things that we don't have. The US Department of Energy spends $6.5 billion a year on basic science. We probably need to spend more.
You're fading out a little bit. So if you could lean forward and talk to me, not as though I'm as close to you as I look, but as though I'm across the room, that would be great.
Yeah, I start to lean back when I'm thinking. So I'll have to, what's the term? Lean in. I'll lean in.
Yes, lean into that. I do want you to think though. Some American politicians would ban the import and export of oil and the domestic production of oil. You question how that could even be done and still have a functioning economy.
Well,
Why?
I think our economy would simply stop. I mean, this, first of all, it's a big, oil and gas is a big industry. It's 12.3 million people before COVID. Secondly, it's really important for manufacturing industries because something I have the number like 65% of fixed business investment was related to it. More importantly, the next time somebody goes in to have a heart operation, they won't be able to put a stent in his heart because they wouldn't have the plastic tools to do it. So, I mean, there are a lot, the medicines you take, many of them are actually ultimately derived from petroleum products. So, but you know what would happen if you banned fracking, which was a slogan? I don't think the people who'd really be happy if we banned fracking is Russia. Because if we ban fracking, they don't like fracking. They don't like shale industry anyway, because it's taken market share away from them and they see it augmenting the position of the United States in the world. So they don't like that. So they'd be thrilled because really, if you say ban fracking, what you're really doing is saying, let's import a lot more oil. Let's get back on the oil import track until such time as every American has an electric car, which will take some time.
You point out that fracking, that this extraction of oil, which has given us a surplus, really requires a lot of time and energy and has a depleting return on it. Do you think the United States will retain that advantage going forward?
I think that's a very good question. And the growth of the shale industry, you'd never seen anything like that before in the history of world oil. It was so fast and so large, kind of took everybody by surprise. If you think of wind and solar as the biggest energy innovations of the 20th century, this was the biggest one of the first part of the 21st century. But at some point before COVID, investors were saying, well, it's great you're growing so fast, but we'd actually like to get some of our money back. We'd like return on our investment. And the industry was going to have to change. And then it went into a crisis like other industries with COVID, what it's done to the economy and to demand. So I think, and so we'll see US oil production at the end of the year will probably be about 15% lower than it was in February of this year. I think when we come out of this, we'll see investment resume. Prices, which have been kind of like a lot of things in our economy, are in what I call the COVID alley. They're just boxed in, and get out of the COVID alley, be more market oriented. And I think you'll start to see a modest growth again. So I think the US will remain one of the big three in world oil. Ross, you know that for years and years and years, people talked about OPEC versus non-OPEC, but that's now changed. That the US, actually the big three players are the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, and how they play the game, what they do is what will really do a lot to shape what the future oil market looks like, and what the geopolitics look like, which is a very important part of the new map.
Daniel Yergin, what are the biggest factors holding back this energy transition, slowing it down?
I think number one is scale, just how, where we are today and where we want to go. Two is I think don't have enough, we need additional technology. Three, no one really knows what the cost will be. Although I have to say the cost of wind and solar have come down a lot. I talked about a shale revolution. There's certainly been a solar revolution, and solar costs are down a lot. And you see a lot of utilities moving in that direction. I think question of supply chains, which really fascinates me. When you look at the scale of what would be involved in making a shift, historically, people have talked about big oil. You're going to need a lot of big shovels, a lot of mining, a lot of moving of minerals and moving dirt from one place to another. So I think that's not focused on. And then that ties into the kind of geopolitics, because China has a particularly strong position in what they call the new energies. At this point, at least, they dominate the lithium ion battery supply chain. 70% of panels come from China, another 10% from Chinese companies elsewhere. And as you know, Ross, the theme of the book is also the geopolitics. And one of the other big themes is this growing rift between the US and China and where it goes. And so I think geopolitics are going to come in and be at play too, tied into the supply chains. So I think those are some of the factors. And just, as I go back to the scale of the system.
I want to return to the US and China in a moment, but one of the other things that could be an issue going forward is that although you think of renewable energy as not requiring digging into the ground, actually it does, because a lot of the minerals, the rare minerals, earth minerals that go into batteries and these other necessary things are very rare and hard to find and expensive to dig up.
Right.
What kind of a factor is that?
And I think there's a lot of opposition to mining in the United States too. So that's why I get into the supply chain. I have a friend who's a chairman of a kind of a post-startup battery company, and they wanted to cease being dependent upon China. So they found another source. Turned out it was China, and India. There's now been some shooting between India and China in the Himalayas, and we just did a big virtual energy conference. We do one every year, but we did it with India, and we had the prime minister there, a number of ministers, and they are looking at the same question. How do they separate their supply chains from this overwhelming dependence on China? So, I think that's overall big task of the new Biden administration is going to be, the number one issue is going to be relations with China, and this is part of the relationship.
And I was fascinated by a recent Wall Street Journal article, and it was about one of Elon Musk's partners in the electric car business. His new business is a firm that recycles those precious minerals found in batteries as a way to not have to dig as much up. Could that be a partial solution or a large part of the solution?
I think what you can say, China has these advantages over there. The US has this advantage is that we're an incredibly innovative society. We have 17 national labs. We have the $6.5 billion, the Department of Energy. We have big companies. We have entrepreneurs, startups. And the guy you're talking about is J.B. Straubel. And he's one of the stars, actually, in the new map, because I tell the story of Tesla through his eyes, because he was the chief technology officer. So I think when you look at the market capitalization of Tesla today, wouldn't bet against JB. So I think that's why I think there's going to be a lot of innovation. I just spoke last week. MIT has a thing called the Energy Initiative, and the amount of effort among people that's going into this is, trying to address one part or another is huge. And so if we're going to have some surprises on the technology side, it's going to come from the United States, I think. And I think, like, as you say, JB, but his story it's a great story because it's one of the stories I love in the book. He goes to lunch in like 2001 with Elon Musk, and they're trying to pitch Elon Musk on an electric airplane. And apparently Musk says, I'm not interested in that. And then JB's been obsessed with this idea of electric cars. And he says, now with lithium ion batteries, you can string them together in a pack, very different than what was tried in the 1990s. And Musk says, I might be interested in that. And that's as near as I can tell, that's the birth of Tesla. And who took Tesla? Automobile makers dismissed it. It's just, but it's like only in America could this happen, and maybe only in Silicon Valley could you, and maybe only with the iron determination of someone like Elon Musk. But if I can just give you a statistic that I looked up the other day, I was really fascinated by it. The stock market value of Tesla, which last year made sold 367,000 cars, is larger than the combined stock market capitalization of GM, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, which sold 42 million cars last year. There's some message there.
Well, also Volkswagen's making a huge run into electric cars. Is the market just skewed there when it values Tesla so much, and all these other companies sell a lot more cars and are also making a serious run at electric cars?
I think they've been really shocked by. They've been shocked. I have the story in the new map of Volkswagen, which was very committed to sort of efficient diesels, and then they ran into what was called Dieselgate. Changed the management. I think some people went to jail. It turned out that they kind of faked their pollution tests, and huge fines that they paid. New management, and they have gone. We're going to electric cars, and the European Union is really driving it with altogether, if the automobile makers do not meet certain standards, looking at $40 billion of fines. You just had California say 2035, you can't sell internal combustion engine cars anymore. Boris Johnson in England, in the midst of a disaster of Brexit and everything, has announced in 10 years, no more internal combustion cars. So in the automobile industry has to, it responds to regulation. It's a pretty regulated industry. And so I think you're getting just this whole effort to sort of re-gear to electric cars, and they're all looking at what Tesla's done, which has created not only a popular electric car, but a very powerful consumer brand.
One of the things that I learned from the new map is how deeply oil profits are embedded in other parts of society. You write that dividends from BP and Shell fund 20% of all the pensions in Great Britain. Are there other ways that oil money is infused into our society that we don't really appreciate? And if the oil money goes away, that money might go away too.
Yeah, well, I think in many different ways, government revenue, it's interesting. Joe Biden has said he wants to ban fracking on federal lands in the United States. As you know, the federal government owns 47% of the 11 Western states. It owns a lot of lands. The Democratic government in New Mexico is not happy with that because they're going to lose the revenues that go to pay teachers. Because governments make a lot of revenues from this. So that's another way it's embedded. But I've been really fascinated by the degree. Well, electric cars actually have a lot of plastic in them. Their bodies are plastic, a significant part of that. So it's in all these different ways that you don't think about clothes, but Tylenol.
Tylenol.
Tylenol. Yeah, if you've got a headache, Tylenol. Yeah.
That's from fossil fuels?
Yeah.
Really?
It's a product, yeah. And the reason that a lot of I never pronounce it right. Tylenol is not ibuprofen, whatever it is.
Ibuprofen.
Ibuprofen is that's Advil. Sorry, I confused. But these products are they're kind of oil based, so it's just a lot more oil and gas based. And during the pandemic, you look at the masks that people are wearing; they're plastic. They're derived from that. So there are a lot of uses of it in it everywhere. And as I say, a hospital. I was talking to a heart surgeon. He was talking about the amount of plastic there is in a hospital operating room. So I think during COVID, in a way, has reminded us that there are other uses. Even if we're not commuting as we used to, but there are other uses for these products, and that we're going to, there'll be other pandemics that will need masks.
I want to ask you to lean forward a little bit
again. Oh, again, am I doing it again?
Okay, you're fading out a little bit at the end, so if you get a little bit closer. I mean, you write that another barrier to the transition from fossil fuels is the cost of moving to renewable resources. And this is one thing I have a hard time understanding, since wind and solar seem like they're a lot more accessible than fossil fuels buried deep in the ground or under the sea. So where are the big costs coming when it comes to the transition that might inhibit it?
Well, unless everybody has an electric car that doesn't, as in China, they have half the world's electric cars, most of them are operating on electricity that's generated by coal. So, I mean, just to kind of keep that in mind, but China will go to the geopolitical reasons. China wants renewables, wants electric cars. It's not just climate and pollution. There are geopolitical reasons too. But solar just was a lot more expensive than other forms of generating electricity because the cost of making the solar panels, but the Chinese just, their manufacturing juggernaut have driven down the cost tremendously. When I started my previous book called The Quest, I interviewed the head of the largest solar panel company at that time, which was a German company. And by the time my book was going into galleys, he'd gone bankrupt because of Chinese competition. So the Chinese have brought down the cost of solar. Wind, it's been brought down by manufacturing around the world because you manufacture these turbines. And if you get larger scale, bigger turbines, they capture more wind and generate more electricity. So that's what's brought down that cost. So where the cost used to be, here and here, it's now much more competitive. So that's a positive for renewables that they've moved in that direction.
Does it still rely on government subsidies, though? If the subsidies were to go away, would that advantage of renewables go away?
I think it depends where you are and how sunny it is or what the wind is in that particular area. But I think that the wind and solar industries certainly want to see those, call them subsidies, call them incentives, remain.
How will this energy transition away from fossil fuels affect the developing world? We talk a lot about developed nations, but there are many nations that lack clean access to cooking fuels that have no electricity at all. There's 1 billion people on Earth, as you point out, who have no electricity. How will this transition affect them?
Well, the World Health Organization says that the biggest environmental problem in the world, this will surprise people who live in the United States, is indoor air pollution from cooking with wood, with waste product from animals and from crop residues. And that's 3 billion people affected. That's, what is that, almost 40% of world population affected by that. And so for them, the need is different. And I have a chapter in the book which describes kind of perspective from developing worlds. And sometimes, they say it's the 700 million versus the 7 billion. At least some people will say that, because they say we need commercial energy in order to deal with these health problems and these that come from and deal with poverty. So India, we heard it the other day when we did our conference, says, well, we see this as a multiple transition because we want to transition to wind and solar, big commitment to that. We also have a big commitment to natural gas because we need to clean up pollution in our cities. India has 6 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world. And so we want to use natural gas. We want to use propane, which is a petroleum product. We give that to poor people so they can cook with that instead of cooking with all those waste products. So I think they have a different attitude. And I have a quote in the book from the Nigerian energy minister saying it's great what they want to do in the Netherlands and Germany, but we have different problems. We have hundreds of millions of poor people, and we have to get commercial energy to them. So it's a different perspective than you might find, say, in Washington State.
I'm speaking with Daniel Yergin. The book is called The New Map. You can see it there over his left shoulder. It's really a sweeping history of how energy affects geopolitics, and just a fascinating book that will catch you up on many things you may have missed and tell you about things that you really have never really heard of. I want to return to something we discussed a little bit earlier, and that is the relationship between the United States and China, which is being portrayed as the big conflict moving forward in coming decades. I wonder if you could talk about how you see this energy transition from oil and gas to solar and wind affecting the relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, if I can, well, let me say something first just about
Sure.
how this relationship has deteriorated. Because I found it very interesting because I collected statements by previous presidents about China, and from Reagan through right up to the present, really, where Democrats, Republicans, they talked about engaging with a changing China, constructive relationship. It's really different now. As you know, and everybody knows, Democrats and Republicans are really divided. But I'll tell you, here in Washington, D.C., one thing that they all agree on is that China's not a partner, but a strategic rival, a peer competitor, great power competition, and the Chinese are treating it the same way. And that kind of split, look what it's done to technology. Look at the battle over Huawei. Look at the battle over TikTok. Or look at the question about visas. Look at the role of, there are 360, at least last year, there were 362,000 Chinese students in American universities, by the way, spending a lot of money. But now that's all become, kind of fraud. So every aspect, the one thing there has been agreement on is climate. And that the key decision that led the way to the Paris Agreement was what I described in the Great Hall of China in Beijing, when Barack Obama and Xi Jinping agreed on a climate deal and put a foundation under what became the Paris Climate Agreement that 195 nations signed on to, but 2 nations were really important, the United States and China. But that kind of cooperation has really faded away. And I focus, for instance, on the area where US and Chinese naval ships have come close to colliding with each other, which is in the South China Sea, which is the most important economic body of water in the world. 2/3 of Chinese trade flows through it, 40% of Japanese trade, but it's also the most dangerous. And it does have, going to your question, an energy component, because China has, ever since the Korean War, has been worried about dependence on imported oil. It managed to conquer that for a while, but now it imports 75% of its oil. And a very large part of it comes through the South China Sea. And what it worries about is the US Navy in the South China Sea. And if there is a standoff over Taiwan, and that relationship has become fraught, what will the US Navy do about Chinese oil imports? So that is one of the reasons the Chinese have basically said the South China Sea is ours. They say it's Chinese territory. US doesn't accept that. Vietnam doesn't accept it. Malaysia doesn't accept it. The Philippines don't accept it. But Indonesia doesn't accept it. But the Chinese have built basically stationary aircraft carriers there. So I think that's part of the energy dimension. We talked before about it in terms of renewables and the supply chains. And then there's the Belt and Road, as it's called, which is the $1.4 trillion Chinese plan to connect Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe to the Chinese economy through loans, through infrastructure, and through energy. And that has a very strong energy dimension too, as well. So energy is an important part. And yet, Ross, here's the irony. Who's become one of the biggest customers for US oil and gas export? China.
I want to talk a little bit more about electric vehicles, because you spend quite a bit of time in the new map on that. And by the way, if you've got a question, just go to the chat function down below and write in the question. I'd be happy to ask your question for Daniel Yergin. You quote an official who says that even if every car in the world sold from today was electric, oil demand would still grow.
Every other car.
Yeah. Why is that?
Because of the embodied demand for oil that exists there and the growth in the emerging markets. I mean, it's if you look around, the oil exporting countries know the United States is not really going to be on a net basis an importer. They look at India, they look at China, they look at Africa. They say that's where the growth is, and as those economies grow, and you look at the number of cars per person in India versus the United States, it's a tiny fraction. So as incomes rise, demand will go up. But that's why when you reach a certain saturation point, and maybe it'll come faster now because of EVs, that's when you reach that, what you described before as peak demand.
We think a lot about cars and people buying cars to drive themselves around, but as you point out, there's a whole different thought process going on about, rather than mobility as a product, a car you buy to take you somewhere, mobility as a service. And we've seen some of the things like Uber playing into that. So beyond how cars are fueled, how might that kind of transition, should it take place, kind of giving up your car, change?
We don't know the future. So yeah. I have kind of what seems a reasonable expectation based upon what we know today, how many cars will be. We, in our company, we have several hundred people who do automotive research. How many cars there'll be in 2050, what share will be electric. But there is a possibility of a very different future, and it sounds futuristic now, but I think that's where you're going, Ross. If you take three things and you put them together. You take electric cars, then you take ride hailing, which would come back after COVID. And if I can pause on that, people's attitudes towards cars, I think, have really changed. People really used to identify with their cars. But now I think social media and other things have taken over from that, that it's not the coming of age thing it used to be for people. And you can see that the average age at which people are getting driver licenses is going up. So, and the quick growth of Uber and Lyft is demonstrative. So take electric cars, take ride hailing, Uber, Lyft, and then take autonomous vehicles, or otherwise known as self-driving cars. And then you could have a really radically different vision that would just break the business model that's existed since Henry Ford's Model T rolled off the assembly line. And that would be people would own companies, not people, companies would own large fleets of electric vehicles, which would not have drivers, therefore they could work all the time. They can be charged at a central location, and they would just be on call to people. And I came up with a term to describe that, called it auto tech. And I think I came up with that term. That's what my colleagues say, at least. It would be questioned then, would that really be automobile companies? Would that be the tech companies? Who would be the dominant? Because the software would be central to everything. Who would dominate that business? And that could be huge business, and it'd be a very different business and a very different attitude towards cars than we know today. So that would be a radically different vision. And then you get into a very interesting question that's already come up, of course. Who owns the data? Does it belong to you, the person who's riding the car? Does it belong to the software who provided the software? Does it belong to the hardware company? What gets used with the data? So for those who are interested in the issue of data privacy, this opens up a whole new panorama.
I did a panel a few years ago about self-driving cars, self-driving trucks. And at that time, it seemed very much of the moment. I haven't been reading as much about it lately. And I'm wondering whether that's just my perception or has the progress on it stalled?
I think it is. It seems to us that the early enthusiasm there has been pushed back, that it is more complicated you can do it in limited ways, but to get to scale. So I think while EVs have accelerated, I think self-driving seems to be farther away. One of the people I talked to for the book named Sebastian Thrun, who won one of the competitions for self-driving cars. And then he went to Google and he ran Google's self-driving thing, which is now a separate company, a separate enterprise at least. He's already moved on he's doing self-driving air taxis. So he thinks that's the next frontier. But I think you're right. I mean, we're reading more and more. If you just did that old thing of doing a survey of the press or a survey of media, what's online, you see more and more about electric cars. But I think autonomous vehicles, it seems to be a harder problem to get to scale.
How will this whole transition from fossil fuels to renewable fuels affect employment? We hear a lot about the green economy and all the new jobs that will be created because of it. But have you taken a hard look at, would there actually be enough jobs created to replace those jobs in the oil industry, to replace all those truck drivers and cab drivers who may not have a job in the future?
I know that argument's there. I haven't looked at the job numbers. I mean, a lot of numbers get there, but I did include, I think there's something like 3 million truck drivers in the United States. And, we're a big country, but those are people, if you started having this vision, which I think you were describing before, where you would have a lead truck and then you'd have all these autonomous trucks following along, that does eliminate a lot of jobs. By the way, if you also, right now it's not a very good time to be an Uber driver, but that was an important source of income and really growing for a lot of people. If vehicles are autonomous, they're not doing that as well. So, economic change, technological change does bring shifts employment. I don't know anybody who's really looked at the entirety of it. I mean, and sometimes it's more sort of in the form of an argument rather than analysis.
I'd like to take a look at the different institutions that will affect this huge transition that is underway now and how they each might impact the transition from fossil fuels to the energy future, which you argue is coming, but the timing on it is questionable. First, let's look at government for a moment. The US is apt to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord under President Biden. More than half of American states now mandate that a share of their electricity comes from renewables. What's government's role in making this transition in energy a smooth one and averting climate disaster?
Well, certainly it's the regulatory environment, what they decide. And I think that we'll see what the Biden administration does. I think it's going to be more inclined to, pardon the phrase, step on the gas on climate and renewables rather than try and compress this other industry, which I think Joe Biden, as a foreign policy guy, knows is actually pretty useful to him in foreign policy on key issues, including Russia and China and their new kind of quasi-alliance. But I think what you've seen happen, the push that's been given to utilities by regulation is, I think that's absolutely pushed it in that direction. The other thing I go back to is the money that we spend on science, on innovation, on discovery, and then taking discovery from discovery to the marketplace. And I did a study some years ago, actually it was under the Clinton administration, on energy R&D for the Department of Energy. And it just left me with the belief that this is so fundamental, what we invest in our scientific research. And no other country is actually spending the amount of money that we are on basic science. And that's a real strength of the country. But we could spend more.
Another government question. The Trump administration, of course, pulled us out of the Paris Accord. It's like accelerating the oil and gas leases on public lands. Taken as a whole, how has the Trump administration affected this energy transition?
Well, I think a lot has actually happened anyway, going back to what you say, because states have their regulations. I think because continuing spending of money on R&D, which has been very consistent. So I think that part has continued. I think that in terms of, I don't think they've had as big an impact as you think, because the shale revolution has really been driven by the private sector, and the oil and gas industry is regulated by states. I mean, they've done things the fringe, and I have a picture in the book of him with Prime Minister Modi of India, kind of selling natural gas. So he's been out there as a salesman for it. But I think when we look back, we'll say it probably had less impact. But I think what is significant, of course, is that Joe Biden says day one, we're going back into the Paris Climate Agreement, and that will put the US back in leadership on climate, which it's certainly not there. I mean, just one way to categorize it, Joe Biden in the campaign had a $2 trillion climate plan. Donald Trump did not have a $2 trillion climate plan.
I realize this is not primarily a political book, but do you think the era of Trump will be an anomaly going forward in what the US government does in terms of encouraging this transition?
I think probably in that sense, yes. I think that I think it will be, because I think, I think it's going to kind of be more baked in. I think that, again, this is not a political show, but I think as a president, you realize that Biden will have to have two things that need to be healed. One is the COVID crisis. The other is American politics. I mean, it's just so deeply divisive. And, our institutions, you realize we take our institutions for granted. We take consensus for granted, that we believe in the institutions, even if we don't like the outcome of the election. And to be in a situation where, at least in one poll, 70% of the Republican voters say they think the election was stolen, that's a big problem in terms of governing. So I think that, so as a president who comes in, Biden, kind of which way does he look? And I mean, there were 71 million people who voted for Trump. That's a lot. So how you manage that, I mean, he's a very experienced politician, Joe Biden. It will be a challenge. And then, of course, there's just the enormous cost of COVID for the US and for countries around the world, the amount of debt and the constraints that that will create as we come out of this.
I'd like to talk also about the role of the utility business in this change. It's a mixture of government-run and private businesses that deliver energy to the consumer. And I just read that America's biggest utility is NextEra. They run Florida Power and Light, and they build wind farms. What role will utilities play in shaping this energy transition?
Well, it is, you're right, NextEra, there are a couple of now, they're these now seen as these sort of the global clean energy majors. It's NextEra, there's Iberdrola, which is a Spanish company, but it's also one of the 10 largest regulated utility companies in the United States. And those are companies that made big commitments to wind, to solar, and have been rewarded by investors, by shareholders. Because as you say, the value of NextEra is, again, if we go to its stock market value, is very high. And if you compare it to oil and gas companies today. And so I think that's been a very positive signal for companies like that. And I think there's a lot of money from investors that want to be invested in that sector.
Well, another part of business is those big energy companies, Exxon and Chevron. How will they shape and be shaped by this energy transition? Many of them are at least making a nod towards moving away from their basic sources, which are oil. But what role will they play in shaping the transition?
I think, at the end of the day, that they're engineering companies is what they really are. And what I see them putting more sort of focus on new technologies of all kinds. Again, it's one of the ironies that I mentioned in the book. Where was the lithium-ion battery invented? In an Exxon laboratory in 1976, when it was thought the world was going to run out of oil. Who was one of the two first solar companies in the United States? It was Exxon. And in the 80s and 90s, the main solar companies and manufacturers in the US were oil companies. They got out of it. You see the European going back into it and making large commitments. I think the American companies are still saying, well, we're going to kind of focus on our business. If you want to invest in a wind company, don't invest in us, invest in a wind company. I think the Europeans are saying, well, we also want to be wind companies. So I think these strategies are changing and kind of adapting to not only government policy, but public opinion.
What about the role of us in this energy transition? We have a big debate in our newsroom about whether individual consumer choices really make much of a difference when it comes to the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables. People go out and buy electric cars. They take other measures. They take mass transit because they feel as though they're helping the climate by making personal choices that reduce their carbon footprint. But how big a role do you think individuals really do play in this transition we're going through?
Well, I think as a class, what we call consumers, who buy things matters a lot, as a class. Individuals, it's something because you believe in it, you do it. I mean, if every car in the world was running on electric, that was not generated by coal or gas or something else, but was generated by wind and solar, you would reduce global anthropogenic human CO2 emissions by about 6%. So it's funny because people think cars are more, a much larger share of it. I mean, cars, there's other issues about pollution, congestion, and so forth. But I think, it's a good way to see it. So if you aggregate consumers, it matters a lot because their choices, what they choose to do. One of the things the automobile makers are going to test are, do consumers want to buy electric cars? Are they confident? Is there a tipping point where just kind of everybody wants to get on board? Or is it, a slower ride? So consumers will matter a lot. But I would say as an aggregate, so if everybody in your newsroom and everybody else adds up their electric car choices, then that would be significant.
I'm talking with Daniel Yergin, and the book is called The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. We've been talking about this as someone who studies this. You also see how energy and geopolitics are covered. And I'm kind of wondering, as an observer of how people are given information about these issues, what aspects do you think maybe get too much attention and what aspects get too little?
Wow, that's a really good question. Um, I think I'd go back to where we're talking about energy transition. I think it's the scale of the energy system we have leads, and that doesn't get us maybe as much attention. So leads people to think that you can just kind of throw a switch overnight and make a change in something that's so massive and that underpins our society. So it doesn't mean it doesn't directionally go there, but I feel, yeah, just understanding how the underpinnings, what we're kind of talking about before. Um, I'll have to think about that more. That's a really good question.
We'll have you back and ask you that question again. Or we'll look for an article on it. I'm sure you can think about that. You were wrapping up this book in the middle of the pandemic, and you ask, so I have to ask you, will COVID-19 speed up the energy transition or slow it down? It's been some months since you wrote that. Do you have any firmer conclusions about it now, a few months down the line?
Yeah, I think that, normally you finish a book 9 months in advance and they take it away from you. I was still working on this in the middle of July, and if we have time, I want to come back and say something about COVID too. I think that there's this disruptive technology called digitalization. I think that work patterns will be changed. Every company I know is asking the question, when do people come back to work in the office and on what kind of schedules? Will people work more at home? If everybody's working remotely, does everybody become a franchisee rather than a member of a company? How do you culture creativity? Running into people in the hallway, just all those things. But I think that work will become more flexible. I think business travel will be replaced. Electrons will replace molecules for some part of business travel. So I think those changes are there. And I think it's, just we couldn't have done what's happening now if we were 10 years ago in terms of technology. So, so in the sense that if it means less travel, less commuting, then that probably, shifts things, kind of accelerates it more. I did get, as I was working on this, I did get very curious as to why was COVID such a surprise. I mean, people like Bill Gates had pointed to it. And I had the sense, and I think you may too, that people thought, well, there'd been various things, but they thought SARS, which was the thing in Asia. And then I went back and looked at SARS. 8,000 people became sick, only 800 passed away. And that just says, why, there were a few people who said, think about this on scale. But it was just, unless it happened, you couldn't imagine it was going to happen. And I think that explains part of the reaction. And, I think last January, we were preoccupied with politics in the country. And because we became so divided politically, it really hampered our response, and including, on what would have just been normal public health measures became politicized. But, and instead we got, we're in still this economic twilight zone. And I mean, one of the things, going back to money and scale, is one of the things that I really worry about is future of small business in America, because those are the people who don't have easy access to credit, they don't have savings, and and yet they're the backbone of so much of our society and our communities. And so I think, in a way, so that goes back to your transition question: how much money will we have to spend on the transition? How much needs to be spent on recovery when we come out of this? And I think, and the wounds of this are going to be deep and will persist.
We have, we believe, an outgoing president who didn't really believe in climate change, didn't think it was actually happening at all. And you alluded earlier to this incredible political divide we have in this country. Do you have any sense of how the fact that we can't agree on basic facts, whether it be about COVID-19 or about global climate change, is that going to impact this transition from fossil fuels to renewables?
I think so. I think we'll see what the outcome of the Senate races in Georgia will be pretty significant for the climate program. And that in Europe, there's a consensus on this. about climate, and they have very aggressive policies, really taking control of allocating credit, heavy regulation, and so forth. And nobody's disagreeing. In fact, the British Prime Minister, although he's not part of the EU anymore, says that by 2030, no internal combustion engines sold in Britain. But we're a different society and a very divided one. I think that makes it hard. If we couldn't agree as a country about what to do, that's a serious problem. And then the fact that, when we had the 2008 financial crisis, the world got together and solved it. Here was every nation was on its own. And I think that bodes ill for dealing with other issues, including climate, that we couldn't do it. And so there is a need to, kind of bring it together again if we're going to really address all of the great issues that we have. And these last few weeks have just underlined that maybe we're even more divided than we knew as a country. And people in one part can't believe that people in the other part of the country believe what they believe, and it's vice versa. So it's we need leadership that can really, indeed, as I guess Joe Biden says, be the president of all Americans.
Well, if you'd like a strong, persuasive, inclusive, and highly readable account of energy and geopolitics, I really highly recommend the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Titans. Daniel Yergin's been telling us about it. I read it from cover to cover, and I'm going to be recommending it to people who would like a better understanding of this. A terrific job with that. And now I'll ask you the impossible question. We've talked about a lot of aspects of the book, but if readers finish the new map with one insight, what would you hope that would be?
Wow. I mean, the hardest thing to write in a book is the second hardest thing is to write the conclusion. The hardest thing is to write the introduction and to say, what is it all about? I think it's about, I think that these two factors of, climate and geopolitics will be so determinant of the future and how they interact and how each of them plays out. So I suppose that, but I guess it's to understand the complexity of it and how interrelated things are. And as you know, Ross, in terms of writing this, I tried to, this is not a heavy academic tome. I tried to really tell stories and make it lively. But I think the messages, and I guess a third point is that I feel very strongly is we really need to take seriously where this relationship with China is going. And as I say, it does have some echoes of pre-World War I in it, and that is very concerning. You get a spiral and a breakdown of communication. And between the world's largest and second largest economies in the world, this is not a good thing. And I think that will be the great test of statecraft in the years ahead. So maybe I've said about three things, I think.
Well, on that slightly ominous, actually majorly ominous final note, Daniel Yergin, thank you so much.
On the other hand, Ross, there are a lot of very good and very amusing stories in the book. So it's an optimistic book, believe me.
And a highly readable book. It's a great read. And with that, thank you so much for your time, Daniel. We really appreciate it. And Grace is joining us to give the benediction.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel Yergin, for stopping by today to tell us about your latest book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. And thank you to KUOW's Executive Producer of Community Engagement, Ross Reynolds, for moderating a very thought-provoking discussion. This event will soon be available on the University Bookstore YouTube channel and also on KUOW's Speakers Forum. And you may purchase copies of The New Map through the University Bookstore website. And a huge thank you to our audience today. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you back at one of our other virtual author events. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.